Infrastructure Ontario has refused to disclose its 95-year lease with Therme, citing third-party confidentiality. The third-party confidentiality exemption under Section 17 of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act applies only to information supplied by the third party in confidence, but the Information and Privacy Commissioner has written, quote, "A contract between an institution and a third party does not normally qualify as having been supplied because its terms are mutually generated," end quote. So is the ministry claiming that the terms of the lease were supplied by Therme? I guess what I'm really asking is, why is Infrastructure Ontario ignoring this explicit guidance from the Information and Privacy Commissioner?
We're very proud of the tenants that were selected to be at Ontario Place. Not only will Ontarians have activities for families to do, we're also going to see a $500 million investment on the site, and we're also going to see annual dollars for annual maintenance in order to upkeep the site so that families can continue to enjoy it.
Thank you,
is a
Chair. I'm reclaiming my time. The question was specific. Is the ministry claiming that the terms of the lease, the 95-year lease with Therme, is the ministry claiming that the terms of the lease were supplied by Therme?
I think if the intimation is that Therme gave us that term and it was not negotiated extensively with them, that is not correct, MPP. It was the subject of much ongoing negotiation in view of the capital investment being made by Therme, a private entity, in its facility at Ontario Place.
Thank you. In that case, as the Information and Privacy Commissioner has written, quote, "A contract between an institution and a third party does not normally qualify as having been supplied because its terms are mutually generated," end quote. So I accept what you have told me, that if there was negotiation and a back and forth, then it would indeed be a contract. So in that case, why is Infrastructure Ontario ignoring the explicit guidance from the Information and Privacy Commissioner? And can we see a copy of the contract, of the lease?
Thank you very much. Again, we are very proud of the tenants that we selected at Ontario Place.
I'm talking about third-party confidentiality, which has been used as the shield. And Infrastructure Ontario, I'd be curious to know if this is indeed a contract, then how can you claim third-party confidentiality? It was signed following an opaque and irregular procurement process that the government and paperwork has said, as I mentioned earlier, is not competitive, was not bound by conflict of interest requirements. The winning bidder was given a publicly funded parking garage that was refused to other bidders. There was a contract between the winning bidder and the bid evaluation team.
10 seconds remaining.
So there was no fairness, Commissioner. How is secrecy here in the best interest of Ontario?
At this time, I have to call it that session.
Were bidders other than Therme then apprised of that change in perspective or approach that the government was now willing to pay for new parking facilities?
After the selection of the three proponents that we had coming out of the call for development process, as we entered into the phase of actual commercial negotiations with those counterparties, all of those selected counterparties were advised of the fact that we were considering publicly provided parking at Ontario Place, consistent with the needs not only of those tenants, but also, we hope, the hundreds of thousands of people who will benefit from the extensive public realm investments that are happening down at Ontario Place.
Thank you. Did the Minister of Infrastructure inform the Premier or Cabinet that under the lease agreement, Therme would be provided with a publicly funded parking garage that had been explicitly denied to other bidders prior to the government's approval of the 95-year Therme lease on April 20th, 2022?
The parking structure is there to serve all residents. It is there to serve the tenants, and it is there to serve all residents. Again, the Ontario line will connect. That will mean that there will be a subway connection to Ontario Place. There's a GO station.
Thank you.
But not everyone will be taking public transit to the site.
Chair, I'm going to reclaim my time. Thank you.
MPP
The NDP obtained evidence via FOI that the government was planning a publicly funded garage near the Therme site at least as early as January 2021, half a year before the government announced Therme as one of the participants in the Ontario Place redevelopment. This is despite the call for development document clearly warning prospective bidders that the government would not pay for such facilities. Were other bidders informed that actually the government was now willing to pay for new parking facilities at Ontario Place and given an opportunity to submit bids based on this new information? I'm looking for a yes or no.
I have a point of order from MPP Smith.
Could the member please direct where in the estimates binder the spending for that is?
It's not really a point of order.
No, it absolutely isn't. And any policy requiring government resources to implement is part of the spending plan. You get the gold star today, Mr. Smith, for interruptions. Well done, you. You've used up a lot of my time, but I have faith that the minister knows what she's talking about and can answer for herself. So, Minister, is this a yes? I'm asking a yes or no.
Please bring your comments through the chair.
Pass it over to Michael Lindsay, CEO of Infrastructure Ontario. I've been clear in the House that a parking facility is absolutely necessary if we want this to be a tourist destination and attraction for families. We are connecting the Ontario line and bringing it to Ontario Place, which will make a far more accessible. There is a go there, but not everyone can take public transit when they're
I-
traveling with their families.
And I've heard this in
And
the House,
so
Minister. I'll
we are
reclaim my time.
This has
10 seconds, 5 seconds.
Did the Minister inform the Premier or Cabinet under the lease agreement Therme
And
would be
thank
provided
you.
with a...
That's the end of the question period. And thank you. I recognize MPP French.
Thank you. And I'm glad to take us back to Ontario Place. Regarding the FOI that the NDP obtained, was the Minister aware that a Therme lobbyist had contacted a member of the bid evaluation team while the bid evaluation process was still underway? Yes or no? Oh, my goodness.
MPP Smith.
I fail to hear anything in that question related to actual spending. We are discussing the estimates of the spending of the Ministry of Infrastructure.
Okay.
Questions that have nothing to do with spending are out of order.
I would encourage all members to tie their questions directly back to spending and the estimates that are
Yes.
before us today.
Thank you. Flip back to page 88. Then, as we had talked about the Ontario Place, in the Ministry's estimates briefing book, page 68, the government has allocated $88 million for infrastructure partnership projects, which includes spending on the Ontario Place rebuild. I'm asking about the Ontario Place rebuild. Also, I find it fascinating that the government members, not the minister, are jumping in to protect the minister. I think I have more faith in the minister's ability to answer for herself than some of her colleagues might. Minister, you don't have to answer, but I am asking you a question. Were you aware that a Therme lobbyist had contacted a member of the bid evaluation team while the bid evaluation process was still underway?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, the Minister has highlighted many times in the House that the process was competitive and fair as should be. I think now is the opportunity for the member to ask about the government spending.
Can you stop?
You will get that opportunity when the
Is
House...
this a point of order?
Oh, my goodness.
And
This
is
is a
the
grown woman who can handle herself, boys. Like,
Thank you.
honestly.
Thank you. And,
You also get a rotation.
and thank you. I will remind the members that they are to, A, bring their questions to the estimates, and secondarily, that any point of order should be risen in the format of a point of order through me before going further. Thank you. I will come back to MPP French.
Okay. Minister, I don't know whether they'll let you try again. If you can answer this for yourself as the grown woman that I have faith that you are.
I will answer the question, and I will say that I think this government does truly understand what government priorities are. I think you can see that reflected in the estimates that we are reviewing today, with the fact that we are constantly increasing not only the operational but capital budget for the Ministry of Infrastructure in order to build this province. We are
Thank you,
providing
Chair.
municipalities with the support that they need in order to ensure we have the infrastructure at hand to serve communities.
Thank you, Minister. It is a yes or no. I can see that that's not forthcoming. If it isn't a no, then I would wonder if you are aware of this. I wonder if you were aware of it prior to the government's approval of the 95-year Therme lease on April 20th, 2022. And that's spending, while we're here at estimates discussing spending. Spending of a lot of money, potentially, eh? Okay.
The Ontario Place Therme lease was put together without brokers, and it's a 300-page lease, very big lease. But a brand new real estate agent, this could have been their first transaction for them to ever work on and look over. A brand new real estate agent, straight out of school, would have caught the mistakes that are in this lease. So some of the mistakes in this lease that do not serve the people of Ontario. No agent. Agents should have looked over this. Lawyers should have looked over this. Accountants should have looked over this. But no, we had no representation, first of all. We can have an agent in the future, but according to the lease, if we're going to have an agent in the future is required to be a Crown corporation. And assignment, the contract can be assigned, it can be sold, and the landlord doesn't have to approve who they're going to be in business with. So the tenant is in control. I would say the tenant Therme more than likely wrote this lease. I don't think this lease had any input from the government at all. Notwithstanding the lease date of May 3rd, 2022 for the Ontario Place Therme lease, the original offer to lease was signed the previous year. On page 173, there's a clause that says there's a termination clause for the previous agreement to lease, and that clause says the offer to lease dated July 29th, 2021 made between the parties is deemed terminated and of no further force and effect from and after the execution and delivery of this lease. So this lease dated May 3rd, 2022, was a replacement lease. There was a previous lease that had been signed, and the termination clause is on page 173. We'd like to know what that lease said. We'd like a copy of that lease. The Ontario Place Therme lease is 297 pages. You can read the 6 most important pages. It's the D schedule. The D schedule is the dispute resolution procedure, which is alternative law. It's a kangaroo court procedure. So we are not going to use courts for any problems that we have with this lease. Any issues arising out of this lease will be dealt with strictly by the Schedule D, unless the tenant permits us, the Crown, to use a court. Now, the tenant does have courts as an option to use against the landlord, but the landlord does not have an option unless the tenant permits us to use the courts. The D schedule says that we're going to deal exclusively by arbitration and not by litigation in court. It also says, including the validity of the lease, even the validity of the lease will be dealt with by this arbitration schedule. And the power these arbitrators have, between 1 and 3 arbitrators, extremely, extremely powerful. So on D4, you'll see that the arbitrators have the jurisdiction and power to amend or vary any and all rules under the Arbitration Act. Wow, so flexible. Including rules relating to time limits, either by express agreement with parties or failing such agreement as the arbitrator considers appropriate and necessary. So that's disclosure. We're talking about disclosure. And to determine the appropriate procedure for the arbitration, including the form in which evidence and submissions will be tendered. The costs of arbitration are at the discretion of the arbitrators. And the arbitrators they can award. Any award by the arbitrator shall be final and binding upon the parties, and both parties expressly waive all rights of appeal, including any question of law in connection with the award of the arbitrators. So this is alternative law, and the Schedule D is the biggest problem I have with the Therme lease. But I would suggest that everyone reads these 6 pages. 297 pages might be a bit much, but 6 pages isn't, and I would suggest reading these pages with some strong looks at D4 and D5. The Ontario Place Therme lease has parking provisions. So the Crown is going to operate, maintain, and repair the parking facility. This is in addition to building it. And the tenant is going to be at the table to tell us how much we can charge for these parking spaces. So on page 154, there is a parking provision section, and it says here that the dedicated and available parking spaces for the tenant, the parties will agree a mechanism to set the maximum prices for the dedicated spaces before June 30th, 2022. And the project, the maximum price of parking does not have the effect of disincentivizing visitors to the project. The landlord shall charge or cause to be charged visitors to the project no more than the agreed maximum pricing for the dedicated spaces. So we pay to build the parking garage. We will operate, maintain, and repair the facility. If it's damaged or anything happens to it, we have to rebuild it. And the tenant will determine what the parking fees will be. So this is why I don't take into account I'm hearing numbers of there's going to be over $1 billion in parking revenue. I don't accept that because there's the clause here is the tenants at the table telling us how much we can charge for those parking spaces, and we have all the expense that's on to operate the facility. The Ontario Place Therme lease has a very unique way of calculating the minimum rent and the rent payable altogether. If you look on page 31, the minimum rent, it says here, so 2 years, 3.5% of $3.5 million an acre of core land. And then if you look further, it says of the land value of such year, 3.5% of the minimum rent index land value for each year. And then further on page 60, there's more discussions about how this rent will work and the base rent ceiling. And on page 92, it says on page 92 that either party shall have the right and privilege to contest or appeal any assessment. So our rent is based on the land values, and yet you have to ask yourself, why would we want to appeal the assessment? And the City of Toronto would also want to ask, why would they want to appeal the assessments? The Ontario Place Therme lease has on page 83 regarding the public plaza. It says the following shall apply with respect to the public plaza. And one of the points is that the landlord agrees to maintain the public plaza as publicly accessible land and shall not construct or permit the construction of any permanent above grade improvements on the public plaza without the prior written consent of the tenant. So the tenant's written consent is required for the landlord to build on the public plaza. The Ontario Place Therme lease does have clauses for determination for convenience on page 148 and 149. The cost to the landlord is $30 million, and the cost for the tenant would be $5 million. So there are termination for convenience clauses listed on page 148 and 149, but that has to be before the building permit is issued.
From the business case led by Infrastructure Ontario regarding the relocation of the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place, on page 2 of the executive summary that was put out in 2023, it says that securing a publicly owned cultural anchor such as the Ontario Science Centre could counter negative perceptions of the commercialization and privatization of this unique waterfront public asset.
The Ontario Place Therme lease, upon termination on page 150 and 151, it says that the landlord shall be obligated to demolish the existing project, save for the Therme public areas, at its own cost upon the tenant's departure, such demolition to commence upon the tenant's departure and to proceed to completion on a reasonably timed basis until the demolition of the project. The landlord shall not be permitted to use the project. So that's on page 150 and 151. We're not going to have a building at the end. And we also don't know what the cost of demolition will be at that time. We don't know what costs will be in 95 years. The business case against the Ontario Science Centre, which was led by Infrastructure Ontario, on page 6, we find the following. Provides a description of the favorable aspects to the preferred option of moving the Ontario Science Centre. So under financial and economic considerations, one of the points in this publication, it says, the relocate option moves the Ontario Science Centre to provincially owned land and allows for future redevelopment of 770 Don Mills site. If vacated early, the province and city could potentially work together to unlock land value at Don Mills via some form of gain share arrangement. So that's in the business case for why the Ontario Science Centre was closed and why it's being relocated to Ontario Place. Regarding the Ontario Place Therme lease, there is clauses regarding taxes and utilities. And on page 92, this should be concerning for the City of Toronto. On page 92, there's a clause that says either party shall have the right and privilege to contest or appeal any assessment. Then there's also a clause further that says that if the utilities are appealed or are contested, that the tenant's not going to be paying the utilities while they're under appeal. Also a little further along, on page 93, It says the landlord and tenant will cooperate in order to prepare a reasonable, fair perspective of value for the demised premises to MPAC. And it says also to explore opportunities for the tenant to reduce its property tax burden. Further, it says the landlord is not in a position to intervene in discussions with MPAC or others concerning the assessment of the property, but the landlord will cooperate without the necessity to expend funds or prepare documents with the tenant in the tenant's efforts to reduce its property tax burden through various programs. So the City of Toronto should have concerns, since they are the ones that have the utilities and the property taxes. They're at both those tables, and it doesn't sound like the tenant is preparing to challenge taxation. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, on pages 164, 165, and diagrams 3 to 5. There are radius restrictions, exclusivity rights, and there are 2 restrictive covenants. So the radius restriction says during here that during the term, the landlord agrees it will not, without the prior written consent of the tenant. The first portion here I'm not concerned about. It's the second portion. It says here, develop or allow any development on the water lots, view corridor, lands that would impact the existing view corridors to the west and south of the lands. The landlord's covenant, this is restrictive covenant number 1, shall constitute a restrictive covenant and shall run with the other lands. The landlord shall cause such restrictive covenant to be registered on title to the other lands. There's the first one. The next one, the landlord's covenant shall constitute a restrictive covenant that shall run with the water lots during the term. The landlord shall cause such restrictive covenant to be registered on title to the water lots. And there's 2 diagrams. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, Schedule G, Appendix 2, page G16. This schedule spells out whose responsibilities it is for permits, licenses, approvals, and agreements. It has a permit to take water, Section 34, Ontario Water Resources Act. So if you take a look at who needs a permit to take water, Section 34 says, by law, you must have a permit if you plan to take 50,000 liters of water in a day from the environment. This includes from a lake, a stream, a river, a pond, groundwater. So this Appendix 2, this Section G is pretty important. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, the entire property Ontario Place is over 100 acres, and this lease is approximately 20 acres. On page 169, it says of the lease, it says that the tenant may register notice of the lease against title to the lands to the entirety of Ontario Place at the tenant's expense. So this is like a collateral mortgage. The tenant's going to register on all of Ontario Place, not just on the part that they're going to be leasing. And regarding assessments, it says that the landlord can have a separate assessment, but when it comes to registering the lease, the tenant is going to register the lease on all of the lands. Regarding the Ontario Place Therme lease, on page 87, environmental matters, environmental risk management, and on page 88, section E, subject to the same procedures, tenants shall be responsible throughout the term for any hazardous substances existing on the lake-fill lands that exceed applicable generic soil, groundwater, and sediment standards resulting from any act or emission of the landlord or any landlord person, it being confirmed that a contractor of the tenant carrying out work or services on behalf of the landlord shall, in such capacity, constitute a landlord person and not a tenant person. So that's on page 88. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, there are 4 ministries that are involved with this lease. So it isn't just in the Minister of Infrastructure. Quite dominant, I see here the Minister of Government and Consumer Services. If you check the permitted encumbrances, you will find there are 4 different ministries involved, and some of these ministers have delegated their authority. So this is one of the issues that I have been bringing up for about 20 years, when government delegates its authority to something else. In this case, it's Infrastructure Ontario. So Infrastructure Ontario has been delegated the authority of some of these ministers, and that is how some of these encumbrances were permitted. But it was 4 ministers involved altogether with the Ontario Place Therme lease, in addition to the Premier, in addition to Infrastructure Ontario. The Ontario Place Therme lease involved 4 ministries: expropriation of Toronto lands and delegation of ministry authority to Infrastructure Ontario. So it was a very huge affair, and it was kept secret from the people of Ontario for 3 years and 2 months. Schedule J is where you're going to find how many ministers were actually involved and what was actually done. And that schedule is the permitted encumbrances for Ontario Place. So this is only a few pages long, and it is a great resource to take a look over to give you a better insight as to what happened and how many ministers were involved. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, in Schedule H16, there is a clause that says no contra preferentum. This agreement has been negotiated and approved by the parties, notwithstanding any rule or maxim of law or construction to the contrary. Any ambiguity or uncertainty shall not be construed against any party by reason of the authorship of any of the provisions contained in this agreement. We would like to know who the authors of the Ontario Place Therme lease are. Who are these lawyers? We would like to know their names. Regarding the Ontario Place Therme lease, there are clauses regarding the lake filling that is being done by the tenant. These clauses are on page 26 and on Schedule G15 and on Schedule G19. The definition of the lake filling on page 26. Lake fill lands are the portions of the lands that are to be created from the deposit of fill in the lake by the tenant. The tenant will obtain the required approvals and permits to fill the lake. The land filling or island construction, disruption or destruction of fish habitat. So that's the Federal Migratory Bills Convention Act. The lake filling lands, it's not part of the core area lands. So there is no rent that is going to be calculated on the new lands being created by the tenant. The Ontario Place Therme lease has clauses regarding remedies for a landlord event of default. They begin on page 140. On the occurrence of landlord event of default, landlord shall pay the tenant $250,000. The landlord agrees with the tenant that such liquidated damages shall be payable whether or not the tenant incurs or mitigates damages. The landlord and tenant agree that any disputes shall be through the dispute resolution procedure and not through the courts. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, $1.5 billion borrowed, even if the interest rate was 1%, would be $15 million a year. We are not receiving anywhere near enough rent to cover these interest costs. Even with the performance rent, we could be collecting around $170,000 a month. But there's a huge shortfall between the landlord's interest costs and the maximum rent that is collectible. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, there are clauses on page 18 and 19 regarding what constitutes the first building permit. The first building permit means the first above-grade building permit issued to the tenant using commercially reasonable efforts, whether conditional or unconditional, with whatever is obtained first, but does not include any building permit required for the landlord's site readiness. First permit means the first applicable permit for initial construction. So this lease is a lot further along than we think that it is. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, lack of funds is a concern. The tenant only has a $5 million deposit with this lease, and there's a clause on page 19 that says that lack of funds for the tenant is not a concern. So it says here that for greater certainty, lack of funds to stay the market for leisure and recreational facilities and any willful or negligent act or omission on the part of the tenant does not constitute force majeure. The tenant having enough money is a concern. And the fact that we've come this far with the lease, with the amount of preparation that the taxpayers have done, we're not worried about the landlord running out of money because it's just going right on to our deficit. That's how we're paying for this. But we are concerned about the tenant not having the funds and the fact that that doesn't constitute a force majeure. On the Ontario Place Therme lease on page 157, regarding the appointment of an agent, the Crown appointment of an agent, it says that if the landlord appoints an agent for the purpose of this lease, the landlord will be deemed to have delegated to the agent as part of such appointment the full power, authority, right, and obligation to deal with this lease and to administer all the terms and conditions on behalf of and in place of the landlord, which is the Crown. If the Crown was going to hire a broker, the time to have hired the broker was prior to the signing of the lease. The lease, specifically, we lose at least $31 billion on this lease, and a real estate broker would have been obligated to go through your expenses and your income, which hasn't been done with this lease. So we don't know what our expenses are. But we will lose over $31 billion on the Ontario Place Therme lease. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, there's much talk about assessments, land assessments, the assessment authorities. So page 92, the way the rent is calculated. What's important, it's worded in a way that we are made to believe that there's multiple assessment authorities. This is not true. There's only one assessment authority in Ontario, and it's the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. They haven't assessed since 2016. They were created by the Mike Harris government in the 90s. Leslie Noble, which was very involved with the Mike Harris government and privatization. She's also in the background on the Ontario Place Therme lease. And the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation was a corporation that centralized all land value assessments to one entity. On the Ontario Place Therme lease on page 166, there's a clause that says that this is not a partnership or joint venture. The parties hereby expressly declare neither their intention nor agreement that this lease or any arrangement between the parties shall be deemed to constitute the landlord or agent and the tenant as partners, joint venturers, or principal and agent, or to create any relationship between the landlord and or the agent and the tenant, other than the relationship of landlord and tenant. The provision for the payment of performance rent in this lease is merely a reservation of a rent and a method of calculating rent. I have never seen a landlord and tenant relationship that looks anything like this lease. I've never seen a landlord willingly lose so much money, millions of dollars a month, while the tenant gets to profit. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, on page 16, there's enhanced ministerial zoning order. So a ministerial zoning order approves development it overrides local planning authority, and there's no public participation. It just takes a development project right to the front of the line. An enhanced ministerial zoning order which the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing grants, is elected to exercise its authority pursuant to Section 47 of the Plan Act to exempt all of the lands from the application of Section 114 of the City of Toronto Act. The Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, we have the lowest housing starts in the history of Ontario when we adjust for population growth ever. And the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing is involved with the enhanced ministerial zoning order for the Ontario Place Therme lease. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, I'm being asked where I'm getting the $31 billion loss number from when our interest on the $1.5 billion is $4 million a month, and we're collecting $170,000 a month, that should work out to $4.3 billion loss at 95 years, except for the money is borrowed, that we've borrowed the money to begin with. So the borrowed money, this isn't a mortgage. Mortgages, the interest only compounds twice a year, but this is just straight debt. So that interest compounds more often, and this debt winds up it grows to, because there isn't enough money coming in to satisfy the debt, the amount just grows. So it just grows and grows. Every month it just gets bigger and bigger. The responsibility that we have taken on, it just grows because the tenant is not paying enough rent, and it compounds to, at today's rates, it compounds to $31 billion at the 95-year mark.
I'm at Queen's Park. Today's the day that the Ontario Auditor released the report on the redevelopment of Ontario Place, the relocation of the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place. That is going to cost 47% more than what we have been told. So that is going to cost, the new Ontario Science Centre is going to cost $1.444 billion, and the Ontario Place redevelopment is costing $2.237 billion. So that's going to make our costs to carry much higher than what I had already stated. And I will work that number out, and I will let you know what that number actually will be.
On the Ontario Place Therme lease, on page 77 of the Ontario Auditor's report, it actually lets us know what Infrastructure Ontario knew prior to signing the lease. So the financial stability of the tenant, there was concerns already at that point, and they signed the lease anyway. The Therme Group had low liquidity and was not cash flow positive. Therme Group's equity value appeared low. It was less than 1 million euros, and the financial strength of Therme Group appeared weak, which would limit its ability to inject cash into the construction, and Therme would ultimately need to raise capital. From the lease itself, I had pointed out that the tenant's lack of funds does not constitute a force majeure. So due diligence conducted by Infrastructure Ontario, entering into a lease with a tenant with this financial weakness. The financial strength of the tenant is very weak. From the Ontario Auditor report on page 66, regarding the $30 million penalty that the province would have to pay. So Infrastructure Ontario, this penalty is payable in liquidated damages if the province does not meet certain site readiness deadlines, such as utility services. And according to Infrastructure Ontario, during the lease negotiations, they asked Therme what the utility services that they require are, but Therme did not provide any concrete details. Infrastructure Ontario committed to the deadline and potential financial liability of $30 million without first agreeing with Therme as to what was needed to meet this obligation. So without knowing what we needed to do, we agreed to a $30 million penalty with this tenant, and it was up to the tenant to tell us what they needed. The Ontario Auditor report on page 32, the Ontario Place stands out as the only waterfront property that was treated as a real estate transaction and not as through the procurement process. So there are three comparables. One was in Chicago, One was the Toronto Quayside waterfront and the City of Hamilton. And the only one that did not have to do public engagement, request for qualification, request for proposal, fairness monitor, and the criteria for scoring to the disclosure to participants. Ontario Place is the only one that didn't have to do any of that, and that is because it was classified as a real estate transaction, which goes back to page 15. Infrastructure Ontario categorized the redevelopment of Ontario Place as a real estate transaction rather than as a procurement. On the Ontario Place Therme lease from the Ontario Auditor report on page 78, the auditor found that Infrastructure Ontario did not do their due diligence in confirming that Therme had, in fact, was citing the spas that they were citing were, in fact, owned and operated by Therme. So Therme cited 6 globally placed facilities under operation, and the auditor reviewed these 6 spas and found that 5 instances where the spa cited was not owned or operated by Therme Group. And in the 2019 submission, Therme cited Therme Erden as one of the 6 spas, which is owned and operated by the Wund family. And Therme does not own or operate Therme Erden. And for them to have cited that in their submission was inaccurate. Therme is, in Canada, is a newly formed company with fewer than 10 employees. And that's who they are. They're not. They're accurate. They were inaccurate in the submissions to government in the past, and including on this lease as well. The Ontario Auditor report, it says on page 31, the Infrastructure Ontario decided to employ a transaction advisor to conduct the CFD process on February 7th, 2019, contracted with a party who also had a subcontractor to provide transaction advisory services related to the CFD. And the subcontractor was a commercial real estate consultant who acted as a broker for the CFD process. On page 172 of the Ontario Place Therme lease, it says, no broker. The parties acknowledge that there is no broker or agent involved in the transaction and arrangement between the landlord and the tenant reflected in this lease. Which is it? On the Ontario Place Therme lease from the Ontario Auditor report on page 9, the auditor found that the $1.1 billion rent payments, the $855 million was common area maintenance, which is what I said we cannot include that. That's not revenue to us. That the $1.1 billion, the present value, the concept of today's dollars being worth more than tomorrow's because of inflation of the rent payments, is only about $163 million, or about 15% of the total nominal amount of the $1.1 billion. So the common area maintenance payments do not represent a benefit to the province, which is what I said. And the Therme, we calculated they will break even on their capital investment around year 21 of operations. We will never break even. We're actually running debt for Therme. So we're like their piggy bank. We're paying $2.237 billion. And they're going to be paying, it works out to like $142,000 a month, where our interest costs are about $6.5 million a month. The Ontario Auditor report on page 41 on page 2 regarding the assessor's framework. It says here that the lead assessor adjusted 25 of 306 consensus scores. The lead assessor then sought and received approval from the assessment team for these new calibrated scores. The auditor found that the assessment process used a qualitative scoring framework was not finalized until after the submission deadline. Participants had no idea the case they were trying to meet. Individual assessor scores were very different. In some cases were altered after the assessor's consensus meetings, referring back to page 41, and it was the lead assessor, which is one individual. One individual changed the assessments on 25 out of 306.
from the Ontario Auditor report on page 54. All the decisions regarding the CFD document stated the government may select one, none, or multiple submissions as part of the process, and all decisions are the authority of the cabinet. But the options were not presented. The only option that was presented to cabinet was the multi-partner approach. The other option, the single partner comprehensive site-wide solution, was not shared with cabinet. All decisions were to be made by the cabinet. However, the cabinet committee did not receive all the options. In essence, the minister's office and premier's office had agreed in principle on the approach for the redevelopment of Ontario Place before taking the decision to the cabinet committee. So the decision was already made, which is why the options would not have been given to the committee who was supposed to be making the decision. Ontario Auditor report on page 18. There was a change of ministry oversight for the Ontario Place redevelopment. Prior to May 2022, the MTCS retained oversight responsibility for the redevelopment of Ontario Place. Infrastructure Ontario, an agency of the Ministry of Infrastructure, provided advisory services to the ministry on the Ontario Place redevelopment project. In May 2022, responsibility for Ontario Place redevelopment was transferred from MTCS to the MOI. So the division, relevant records and division responsible for the redevelopment moved to the Ministry of Infrastructure. So the May 2022 lease that we have, which was signed with this ministry, there was a previous lease. This is a replacement lease for a lease that was signed July 29, 2021, which would have been when the oversight was with the previous ministry. We would like to know who signed the previous lease that this lease replaces, and we'd like to see a copy of that lease. That's from page 73 of the lease. On the Ontario Place Therme lease from the Ontario Auditor report, page 66 and 67, the Infrastructure Ontario agreed to a $30 million penalty without knowing what was required to meet the interim utility services for the tenant. And we are within the 1 year cure period, which took us to December 31st this month. So there's 20 days left. Infrastructure Ontario was in discussions with Therme as to when the services will be met. And in October 2024, Infrastructure Ontario told the auditor that the province and Therme are in discussions regarding the specific interim utility capacity levels required by Therme. And Infrastructure Ontario was told that it is expected the discussions to conclude by December 31st, 2024, which is the same date that the condition is due. So they're going to stop talking. They're expecting the discussions to end on December 31st, 2024, and the deadline to meet this condition is December 31st, 2024. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, with the information disclosed from the Ontario Auditor report, the $2.237 billion taxpayer investment, there are no returns on this investment because the tenant doesn't pay anywhere near enough rent. So every year, this $2.237 billion is not paid down. The debt actually grows. Every year it grows and the interest compounds for 95 years. At 95 years, this $2.237 billion will have grown. The debt will have grown to $85.7 billion. This is a very bad deal and it must be cancelled.
From the Ontario Auditor report, the cost to build the parking structure could be over $400 million. 7 out of 10 of the submissions included participant-funded parking. Thermes also included paying for the parking. It was Infrastructure Ontario that recommended to government that the parking be built by the government and maintained to generate revenue for the province. And the provision for the parking was approved by the Treasury Board. So on page 143 of the lease, there's a provision here that this parking could generate very significant penalties for the province for not building this parking structure that the tenant originally had offered to build. And then on page 154, the parties will agree a mechanism to set maximum prices for the dedicated spaces on or before June 30th, 2022. The landlord shall charge or cost to be charged visitors of the project no more than the agreed maximum pricing for the dedicated spaces. That's exactly what Infrastructure Ontario said they didn't want to happen. From the Ontario Auditor Report on page 8, according to Infrastructure Ontario, Therme confirmed in writing on October 2nd, 2024, one day prior to Therme releasing the details of the lease, that their estimated capital expenditure was now $700 million. Despite this written confirmation, Therme's lease agreement with the province, there's no obligation for Therme to make any capital investment. In contrast, the province's lease with Live Nation states that a minimum capital investment will be made by Live Nation. So it's not in the lease. They don't have to make any capital investment. From the Ontario Auditor Report on the Ontario Place Therme lease on page 52, Infrastructure Ontario, one of the drawbacks to one of the submissions that they were looking at is that any perceived engagement outside of process may result in judicial review. So they were concerned that it could look like laws are being broken and that this would go to a real court. So judicial review in real courts is a common theme of a fear for Infrastructure Ontario, or something to be avoiding, because Schedule D, the arbitration schedule, is that avoids courts and it traps the Crown in arbitration. The Ontario Auditor Report, page 35, the call for development did not follow best practices. The call for development process did not include a fairness monitor. A fairness monitor is an independent third party that observes the procurement and ensures the advertised process is followed and that all parties are treated fairly and equally. That was missing. Didn't have that. On the Ontario Place Therme lease from the Ontario Auditor Report on page 61 and 62, with 3 working days left to go on the original bid line, on August 28th, the government extended the deadline to September 24th. And on August 28th, the representatives from Therme asked whether there would be an extension, indicating they'd been told in an earlier meeting with the government that the deadline be extended. The email stated, "We understand from the meeting recently with the government that the September 3rd bid deadline will be extended." Therme's meeting with government officials occurred on August 22nd, 2019, indicated that they had 6 days advance notice, knowledge of the extension. The auditor on page 34 reported that important decisions were not made prior to the launching of the call for development, including who would be the master developer, whether proposals that did not involve construction partnerships would be accepted, who was expected to pay for parking. And the participants told the auditor that from what they witnessed, from the quality and the depth of the submissions, one was only 12 pages long, another one was only 1 page, that the process was not designed to lead to a concrete outcome. The call for development contained the following language. The call for development process is not a procurement of tender process and is not subject to tendering law duties. At any time, the government reserves the right to modify the terms of this call for development, including termination or extension of the process. So therefore, participants did not invest in their CFD proposal as much as they would have done so, where a concrete outcome is presented. So the way that it was presented to participants, it wasn't presented in a way that really led to quality submissions, or for the participants to know, again, like what the case was that they were trying to meet. The Ontario Auditor revealed on page 37 that the assessment framework was not finalized until September 25th, 2019, which was one day after the extended submission deadline. This was months after the call for development was launched on May 20th, 2019, and it was after submissions from participants had actually been received and one day after the extended submission deadline. That's when the assessment framework was finalized. The Ontario Auditor reveals on page 6 that the Ontario Place call for development process was not required to follow typical procurement law directives. The call for development process required participants to sign a non-disclosure agreement and to complete a participation form that contained unusual disclaimers such as the province may select a party which did not submit a response to this process, such as the development concepts of which response did not meet the requirements. This is contrary to the Call for Development and Realty Directive, both of which strive to be an accountable and transparent process. The Ontario Auditor revealed on page 10 that there was no public engagement prior to or during the call for development. No public consultations were held prior to the design and release of the call for development that could have informed a vision for Ontario Place, the overall plan for the site, or the criteria for evaluating participant proposals. Between August 30th, 2021 and September 12th, 2023, the Ministry of Tourism and Infrastructure Ontario held a total of 17 consultations with the public and other stakeholders on various topics such as the use of the site and environmental impacts of development. In Infrastructure Ontario's summary of the public engagements, the key sentiment was, why now? What's the purpose? Why wasn't the public consulted prior to partner selection? The lease was signed July 29, 2021, and the first engagement was August 30th, 2021. The Ontario Auditor revealed on page 10 that on December 6, 2023, which was the day that Queen's Park was closed early, the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act 2023 was passed. The province exempted Ontario Place redevelopment from obligations under the Environmental Assessment Act, the Environmental Bill of Rights, and the Ontario Heritage Act. So this means that the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act exempted the province from all the requirements and consultation. The Ministry of Infrastructure does not have to consult the public under the Environmental Bill of Rights to consider the public's feedback before the act was passed. So this is the exemptions forever into the future until this is changed. The Rebuilding Ontario Place Act exempts all three of these. From the Ontario Auditor Report on page 19 regarding recent legislation, December 6, 2023, the day the legislature was closed early, the New Deal for Toronto Act received royal assent. Embedded in this act was the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act. So notably in this act states the Lieutenant General, Governor, and Council considers it necessary or desirable to facilitate construction. The Lieutenant General may make regulations imposing limits and conditions on the powers of the City of Toronto. This is very concerning because it is the City of Toronto that will be issuing building permits, usually. And the next one is exempts Ontario Place from the Environmental Assessment Act, exempts Ontario Place from the Ontario Heritage Act, states that no cause or action can arise against the province, Infrastructure Ontario, any current or former member of the Executive Council, or any current or former employee, so no lawsuits. Empowers the Minister of Infrastructure to issue a minister's zoning order for the Ontario Place site. Ontario Auditor found on page 26 of her report that the cost of moving the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place is going to be $400 million more than what was estimated. The total is now $1.444 billion for a smaller Ontario Science Centre, and we're dealing with the closure and the damage to the brand name. Ontario Science Centre is a world-known brand name, and there's damage being done right now to that brand name. But the cost of moving it, the cost of staying over 50 years would have been $1.304 billion. Costs include regular maintenance, like buildings require maintenance, real estate requires maintenance. You're going to need a roof, you're going to need heating systems, you're going to need plumbing. This is standard with all real estate. From page 28 of the Ontario Auditor Report, there was no public input sought from June 2012 till August 2021. The people of Ontario still offered their ideas. There were over approximately 200 unsolicited emails and suggestions for Ontario Place. So the ministry still got many suggestions from the people of Ontario, even though nobody asked for our opinion. But the public, well, what the public wanted was important, and it would have made the process more open and transparent to the public. It would have prevented many of the issues, lawsuits, media attention, and it would have saved us $8.5 million on legal fees associated with the 2019 call for development process, the Ministerial zoning order, lease negotiations, and associated work. This is part of the reason that we have a debt increase of $92 billion in Ontario over the last 6 years. On the Ontario Place Therme lease from the Ontario Auditor Report on page 57 and 58, on May 28th, Toronto waterfront opportunity call for development was publicly announced. Parameters for the proposal submission process. One of the rules stated no communication with government staff or appointed officials is permitted during the call for development process. 3 participants attended with staff from the Minister's office and Premier's office early in the open period, and the transaction advisor sent out an email inviting participants to have a confidential information meeting with senior level government stakeholders to present any aspect of their development concept. This was an invitation for participants to present their submissions directly to government, which was against the CFD process. Further down, it says, this meeting is not mandatory and is intended only for those participants making a comprehensive submission who have not previously met with government regarding the Ontario Place for Development opportunity. A total of 21 meetings held with government officials during the open period. Neither the Ministry nor Infrastructure Ontario could provide an attendee list to these meetings. No meeting minutes, no materials were kept, but this was against the rules of the CFD process, and some participants were invited to come present their offers, while other participants, they were pretty much encouraged to stay home. Revealed on page 72, the province is to pay over $60 million to relocate sewer pipes to accommodate Therme Beach. This is due to the land owned by the City of Toronto, and the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act transferred that land from the city to the province. And there are combined sewer outflows, which are in infrastructure owned by the City of Toronto, on this property. So the province did not identify the need for these modifications prior to finalizing the lease agreement. It could have negotiated cost sharing with Therme, or even better yet, how about an easement? An easement could have been negotiated, since we do have lawyers within government that understand such things. And we also know where the infrastructure is. So this could have been taken care of ahead of time, but $60 million cost to the taxpayers, just more cost. This is the type of actions that is contributing to a $91 billion debt increase over the last 6 years. On the Ontario Place Therme lease from the Ontario Auditor Report on page 74, early works and West Island demolition were awarded without open procurement. Early works was awarded to contractor A. Site servicing was awarded to contractor B. West Island demolition was added to contractor B's site servicing contract without an open procurement. An early works contract was cancelled for contractor A and awarded to contractor B. So contractor B wound up with all the work undertaken by government was given to one contractor. The Ontario Auditor Report, page 85, the use of enhanced minister zoning orders overrides the City of Toronto's planning and public consultation processes. The Act gives the province new authority that is specific to the development of the Ontario Place site. Under the Act, the Minister of Infrastructure is granted the power to issue ministers' zoning orders for the Ontario Place site. On May 17, 2024, the Minister of Infrastructure issued an enhanced ministerial zoning order for Ontario Place, which established detailed development permissions and exempted the redevelopment from the city's municipal site plan control. As a result of the enhanced ministerial zoning order, the city cannot prevent the issuance of licenses, permits, or approvals for development at the Ontario Place site under its official plan. From the Ontario Auditor Report, page 84, 85, and 95, there were 19 recommendations made by the auditor. 18 of them were accepted. One was not. The one that was not accepted was in relation to the Heritage Impact Assessment Report. So in October of 2023, there was a Heritage Impact Assessment Report drafted by a consultant, and there was identified impacts of the redevelopment work on heritage attributes across the entire Ontario Place site. And prior to the report being finalized, the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act 2023 received royal assent and exempts the entirety of the Ontario Place site from any obligations under the Ontario Heritage Act, meaning that the ministerial consent is not required. So the recommendation 19 was not accepted. So the recommendation was the Ministry of Infrastructure finalize the site-wide draft 2023 Impact Assessment Report. And the Ministry of Infrastructure does not accept this recommendation and notes the site is exempt from the Ontario Heritage Act. The auditor found 13 main findings. The cost to the province have increased $1.8 billion since the call for development. Costs to the province were not fully considered or presented to decision makers. Cost to relocate the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place is more expensive. The Premier's office and Minister's office met with 3 participants early in the open period against the rules, and then they met with the same 3 participants again. The same participants, some participants had direct access to the Infrastructure Ontario's executive. Ontario Place call for development process was not required to follow typical procurement law directives. It was categorized as a real estate transaction. 1/3 of assessment criteria used to assess participants was not disclosed to them. Assessment process was irregular, subjective, and not always followed. The lease terms include a $30 million penalty for not meeting the tenants and term utility service requirements. This deadline's in 2 days. After submissions were closed, one participant was briefed by the Premier's and Minister's offices and was asked to resubmit their submission, and this was received 70 days after the submission deadline. Province publicly announced a $700 million investment by the tenant. However, the lease does not include any obligation for the tenant to make any investment. The lease was signed July 29, 2021, and public consultations began 31 days later. The province wrote new legislation to exempt the Ontario Place development from obligations under 3 acts, to bypass public consultations, and to derail the 2023 Heritage Impact Assessment that was underway when the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act received royal assent.
The tenant is in a position to extract penalties from the Crown by arbitration. Page 66 and 65 of the Ontario Auditor Report reveals that Infrastructure Ontario agreed to pay a $30 million penalty for not providing interim utility service required by Therme without first agreeing on what was needed to meet this obligation. This deadline's within the one-year cure period of December 31st this year. Infrastructure Ontario told the auditor it's expected that discussions will conclude by this same date. December 31st is too late to stop talking.
From the Ontario Place Therme Lease, page 37, regime change date means the latest of the following. The date that all of the landlord initial obligations are completed. The date the final approval of plans and drawings for all or any part of the lands pursuant to Section 114 of the City of Toronto Act 2006 by the city is obtained, or the enhanced MDO has been issued, and the first permit date. The Ontario Auditor revealed that the negotiated lease terms include significant penalties for the province but allow for early termination. The interim utility services deadline passed on December 31st, 2023, but the agreement includes a one-year cure period that extends the deadline to today. At the time of the audit, Infrastructure Ontario was in discussions with Therme when the interim service will be met. On page 67, it says that in 2024 October, Infrastructure Ontario told the auditor the province and Therme are in discussions regarding specific interim utility capacity levels required by Therme, and Infrastructure Ontario told the auditor it expected the discussions to conclude by today. If Therme were to take the view that the province or is likely to become in default of its initial obligations, Therme has the ability to issue a conditional termination notice if not cured within 180 days of receiving the notice. Therme could terminate the lease and the province would be liable for the $30 million in liquidated damages. The province would have the ability to dispute any such notice, and at the time of the finalization of this report, no such notice had been issued by Therme. If the conditional termination notice is not issued by Therme, then starting January 1st, 2025, Therme may issue an invoice for liquidated damages in the amount of $250,000 every 180 days up to a maximum of $30 million. However, if the province is not able to complete the initial obligations, such as interim utility services, the lease allows the province to terminate the lease for convenience and pay Therme $30 million for exercising its termination right. So that has to happen by today. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, was the interim utility service requirement met? Did Infrastructure Ontario and the tenant make any amendments to the agreement? When will the public know? Were any notices received by either party? It took 3 years and 3 months for the government to release a copy of the lease. The Ontario Auditor found that the assessment process was irregular, subjective, and not always followed. After the close of the CFD, the Vice President from Infrastructure Ontario reached out to one of the participants to obtain substantially new information on its submission to allow for a reassessment. And on December 3rd, 2019, the participant's lawyer emailed Infrastructure Ontario submitting an enhanced version of its presentation 70 days after the CFD submission deadline. This submission was accepted. This is preferential treatment. Only one participant had this reassessment, and only one participant was permitted to resubmit 70 days after the submission deadline.
Following a competitive procurement process, our arm's-length agency Infrastructure Ontario has awarded the site servicing contract for Ontario Place.
It's awarded to Ellis Don Civil.
On the Ontario Place Therme lease from the Ontario Auditor report, the auditor revealed that key environmental assessments will not be conducted on the Ontario Place site, even though many concerns were raised by the Toronto City Council and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. With the passage of the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act 2023, the government exempted future government-led development on the site from having to be assessed. Infrastructure Ontario and Ministry of Infrastructure accepted all but one of the directed 19 recommendations, and that was in relation to completing the environmental assessment, the heritage assessment. The Ontario Auditor pointed out on page 9 that the province's October 3rd, 2024 press release noted nearly $2 billion in revenue from Therme over the 95-year lease. The contributions consist of $1.1 billion in rent payments and $855 million in common area maintenance payments, which do not represent a benefit to the province. So we're talking about $1.1 billion. The present value of the rent payments is only about $163 million, or about 15% of the total nominal amount of $1.1 billion. So therefore, we know that today's dollar values that we're given, there's $2 values that we are given of today's, which we can use to work out some of our formula. One of them is the $163 million of today's value of the rent. The other one is today's value of the costs of the $2.237 billion. When you take away the $163 million of rent revenue, that leaves $2.074 billion that needs to be financed. That needs to come from somewhere, and there's no revenue here. The rent is only $163 million. So that revenue needs to be, that capital needs to be financed. The Ontario Place Therme lease, the revenue from the rent is not enough to cover the interest payments on the $2 billion debt. Therefore, the $2 billion debt interest payments over 95 years. On page 180 of the fall economic statement, the government had released what the interest rates have been for the past 35 years on the debt. So those rates that we have been paying historically, the lowest was 3%. And the highest was 10.9%. So at 3%, $2 billion over 95 years, compounding interest monthly, the interest will be $32.452 billion. And if the interest rate is 10.9%, which is the highest that it was, the interest on the $2 billion over 95 years, compounding monthly, is $59.9 trillion. At 6.57%, the interest would be $1 trillion. Therefore, the interest on this $2 billion is very costly over 95 years. The Ontario Auditor report, Infrastructure Ontario, had sought a legal opinion in May 2018 whether it was appropriate to conduct it under the Realty Directive and that the Procurement Directive did not apply. And the legal opinion from external legal counsel was that since the process would not have procured goods and services and would not have created legal rights, that it did not constitute a procurement. The procurement rules did not apply, and the process was about the disposition of real estate property. The Realty Directive was amended in February 2019, and what was changed is there's four categories, four principles that guide the application of the Realty Directive. The very first directive was changed. It used to read, fair, open, and transparent processes, and that has changed. That was amended to say realty decisions are transparent and accountable. So those say two very different things. But since they had gotten the legal opinion in 2018 on the Realty Directive, the very first principle of what the Realty Directive, the guideline is, was changed. The Ontario Auditor Report, pages 53 and 54, the multi-partner approach was presented as the preferred option by Infrastructure Ontario. The 8 primary partners recommended by Infrastructure Ontario in the December 11, 2019 briefing included 3 anchor tenants, Therme, Live Nation, Eco Recreo, along with the Ontario Science Centre. Infrastructure Ontario also recommended 6 potential supplementary partners that could be considered by government through future lease negotiations. So this tells us that Infrastructure Ontario has had it in their plans to move the Ontario Science Centre to the Ontario Place site since December 11th, 2019. On the Ontario Place redevelopment from page 56, speed of delivery considered a key factor in selecting multi-partner approach over a single partner. The speed of delivery was considered in relation to 4 factors. How quickly could the development start? How would it be phased over time? How could interim activation activity be accommodated? How contentious and complex were approvals likely to be? Under the 3 options, construction was expected to begin at different times. Multi-partner option, multi-partner phased option, comprehensive site-wide option. Despite not being one of the 4 primary areas of consideration outlined in the CFD, Infrastructure Ontario and the Ministry considered speed of delivery, how quickly can development start, a major factor in its decision-making process based on the prioritization of speed of delivery as one of the key factors. The single partner approach was deemed not to meet the government's priority. The Ontario Auditor found on page 58 that contrary to the CFD rules, some participants had direct access to an Infrastructure Ontario executive. The auditor found that a vice president of Infrastructure Ontario communicated directly with at least 2 participants during the CFD open period. This is against the CFD's stated process. This vice president was involved in the design, execution, and assessment of the CFD submissions. He had direct reports who were assigned to the assessment team. Documentation we reviewed shows that the vice president communicated with participants on several occasions. From May 28, 2019 to September 24, 2019, the vice president exchanged 9 emails with a lawyer representing Therme. The vice president and Therme's lawyer also spoke on the telephone on July 22, 2019. We are unable to determine what was discussed during this call. Examples of correspondence included discussions about media interest about Therme's involvement in the CFD process, introduction to the transaction advisor, an invitation to an event at legal counsel's firm, and to set up a phone call. On August 23, 2019, an executive from participant B emailed the vice president to request a call. Based on email correspondence, the auditor confirmed that the call occurred. On September 3, 2019, email correspondence showed that the vice president spoke to the director of participant E. According to the Infrastructure Ontario's website, there are 4 vice presidents at Infrastructure Ontario. The Ontario Auditor pointed out on page 63 that 112 non-disclosure agreements were issued by Infrastructure Ontario, and 1 participant submitted their non-disclosure agreement on August 26th, which is 5 days prior to the original submission deadline of September 3rd, and they submitted on the extended submission deadline, which only 1 participant was given advance notice, 6 days advance notice, that the government was going to be extending. So it was extended by 3 weeks. From page 65 of the Ontario Auditor Report on the Ontario Place redevelopment, Infrastructure Ontario hired a lease advisor to engage for a specific assignment, including 3 participants to assist Infrastructure Ontario in negotiating favorable terms with potential tenants of Ontario Place. This vendor was required to conduct an appraisal of the lands based on market-based comparables to inform the lease payments, revenue agreements, and lease durations. This methodology must provide examples of other similar leases, comparable financial feasibility, and rent terms. The Realty Directive states where real estate is being disposed of by lease, it must be disposed of at the market rate. Infrastructure Ontario was not able to reach an agreement with Eco-Recreo. Infrastructure Ontario executed a 75-year lease with Therme with an option to renew an additional 20 years. While the Realty Directive provides guidance on the market rate of leases, it does not provide any guidance on the length of the lease. The lease agreement with Live Nation is 30 years with an option to renew an additional 15 years. So I don't see any comparable for a 95-year lease. The only thing that I see comparable would be the 407 lease. From pages 73 and 74 of the auditor report on Ontario Place redevelopment, one of the anchor tenants withdrew from negotiations because Infrastructure Ontario did not provide accurate cost information during negotiations. The tenant was not able to make informed decisions. The tenant's costs went from $700,800 to $1.6 million within only 15 months. Property taxes were estimated at $87,000, which is only 27% of the $323,000 in taxes. CAM charges were projected at $76,200, which is only approximately 10% of the $741,000 estimate. The tenant noted that CAM charges and property taxes were significantly higher than the estimates provided 15 months prior. The insurance requirements were 10 times the standard for an adventure park. Eco-Recreo cited a reduction in projected revenue due to other tenants offering previously exclusive services such as kayaking and paddleboarding, therefore concluding the terms of the lease would not enable them to develop a successful and viable project at Ontario Place. The Ontario Auditor report on page 79 and 80, the environmental assessments identified risks and mitigation measures, but the province exempted itself from future obligations under the Environmental Assessment Act. The environmental assessment found that the use of heavy equipment and fuel on site could result in spills that could impact soil or groundwater. It also found that the direct effects from physical removal or alteration of natural features for site servicing could contribute to the loss of vegetation and associated wildlife habitat. The natural features that are mentioned here, those are the over 800 trees. The New Deal for Toronto Act takes away power from the City of Toronto because embedded within the New Deal for Toronto Act is the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act. Within that, it states that if the Lieutenant Governor in Council considers it necessary to facilitate construction at the Ontario Place site, the Lieutenant Governor and Council may make regulations imposing limits and conditions on the power of the City of Toronto. So the City of Toronto lost power within the New Deal for Toronto Act. On page 32, unlike the Ontario Place redevelopment, other large-scale developments that are publicly funded and involve real estate transactions have proceeded as procurements. There are examples such as the development of Pier 8 by the City of Hamilton, Waterfront Toronto's development of Quayside in Toronto, and the Bronzeville Lakefront development in Chicago. Compares the procurement process of these waterfront developments with the CFD process for the redevelopment of Ontario Place. Ontario Place is in a league all of its own. No other waterfront was treated the way that Ontario Place's waterfront was treated. Therefore, these comparables, nothing's comparable. Only Ontario Place. On the Ontario Place redevelopment from page 26 and 27, Infrastructure Ontario recommended relocating the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place. December 11, 2019, in a briefing to the Minister's Office and the Premier's Office about the Ontario Place call for development. The March 2023 business case completed by Infrastructure Ontario to relocate the Ontario Science Centre. This is over 3 years after the fact. So Ontario Science Centre, the decision to The idea to relocate it to Ontario Place was December 11th, 2019. And over 3 years later, Infrastructure Ontario made the business case to move the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place. And the costs were not known. If you look on page 27, it says the estimated costs of relocating the Ontario Science Centre had not yet been approved by the Treasury Board. As some of the increases in the costs include an additional basement level, below ground loading dock, and structural foundation work.
How are we paying for this Ontario Place, this $2.2 billion? Like the level of debt that Ontario has been incurring, even like the debt for the Ontario Place deal, right? Like where's the cash register for Ontario Place? Where does the $2.2 billion come from? I've read that lease 4 times at least. And then I've been doing like daily clips on it since I finished reading it maybe about a week after it was out. And I had gone through and highlighted. How
many pages?
It's 300 pages. And then the auditor report came out and I read that. And then I was taking parts of the auditor report and referencing it back to the lease. So I've been going really hard on that lease for like months. Even when I was away, and I would do a daily clip every day and I'd put it on.
But it's still moving forward. It's still
moving forward, but I've put a lot of things on the record of, but the biggest thing is how are we paying for this? How are we paying for this Ontario Place, this $2.2 billion?
That's right now.
And the income on it's only worth $163 million, the 95 years worth of income on that thing. And if you read Schedule D, if you don't read any part of that at all, but just read the 5 pages, I think it's about 5 pages of Schedule D, and see what the powers these arbitrators have. They have powers as if they're a court. The decisions are not disputable or appealable, even if they're wrong in law, even if there's error. So if you read those 5 pages and say, this is what our Crown Corporation committed us to in a 95-year lease with this tenant, that when we have a problem, all the tenant has to do to not pay their utilities is just keep them in appeal. If their utilities are in appeal, they don't have to pay the utilities to the city. Like they can just they can appeal their taxes and just not be making payments. It's so one-sided. Like if I looked at, if you were to say to me, if you didn't tell me who Infrastructure Ontario was and say, here's the deal and here's this, and you said to me, who are these people? Who's Infrastructure Ontario? I was like, that's the real estate agent of the tenant. That's what I would say. That's the tenant's real estate agent.
So label it as such.
That's what I would say. That is not a Crown Corporation that traps our Crown in arbitration. If you're a Crown Corporation, you're not a Crown Corporation of this country. You're somebody else's Crown Corporation. So this is a very ugly deal they got us into. Very ugly.
The most important part of the Ontario Place Therme lease is the Schedule D, which is a dispute resolution procedure. What it says here is it says that all disputes, controversies, or claims arising out of or relating to a matter in this lease or the breach, termination, enforcement, interpretation, or validity of this lease, including all material disputes, shall be resolved in accordance with the provisions of the Schedule D. This lease, including the Schedule D, constitutes an agreement to arbitrate and shall be specifically enforceable. The award of the arbitrator shall be final and binding upon both parties. Parties expressly waive all rights of appeal, including on a question of law, with the award of the arbitrators. The party prevailing in the arbitration may enforce any award by any means permitted by applicable law, including entering the award as a judgment of any court. This is a very strong arbitration schedule. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, Article 9, page 91 and 92, regarding taxes. Section D, either party shall have the right and privilege, if acting in good faith upon reasonable notice, to contest or appeal any assessment or to apply for reduction of the amount of any eligible taxes, and pending such appeal or application to refrain from paying any eligible taxes. If at any time during the term there's any credit, rebate, refund, discount, exemption, adjustment, reduction, or the like of eligible taxes, and the landlord or the agent receives such credit, rebate, refund, discount, exemption, adjustment, reduction, or the like, it shall reimburse the tenant for its share. So this is page 92 of the Ontario Place Therme lease. From page 200 and page 201 of the Ontario Place Therme lease, regarding the dispute resolution procedure, it says here, the arbitrators shall have the jurisdiction and power to amend or vary any and all rules under the Arbitration Act. Amend or vary any and all rules under the Arbitration Act. From the Ontario Place Therme lease, pages 120 to 124, Article 14 deal with transfers. It says on page 123 that no approval by the landlord of any transfer shall apply to any subsequent transfer. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, Article 16, pages 126 to 150 deals with default and remedies. It says here, any tenant event of default, the landlord may make a claim under the dispute resolution procedure. The tenant shall have 30 days from the date that the landlord delivers written notice of the tenant event of default to dispute pursuant to the dispute resolution procedure whether a tenant event of default had occurred and whether the landlord was entitled to exercise any right or remedy in respect thereof. The landlord and the tenant agree that any dispute shall be through the dispute resolution procedure and not through the courts. If the tenant issues a notice of dispute under the dispute resolution procedure, then section 5.1 of the dispute resolution procedure shall be immediately applicable. From page 131 regarding tenant default, it says, the tenant event of default cure period shall commence on receipt of the tenant from landlord of a warning notice in respect of such material tenant event of default. The tenant fails to pay any portion of rent or sales tax when due in each case for a period of more than 30 days. The tenant shall have 60 days to cure such default. On the Ontario Place Therme lease, from page 31, minimum rent. The formula looks rather confusing, but the best way to look at the rent that's payable for the 95 years on this lease is the way the Ontario Auditor described it. Today's value of the rent for 95 years is only $163 million, and today's cost for the Ontario Place redevelopment is at least $2.237 billion. So you don't have to be a mathematician to realize that when you're only collecting $163 million and you're paying $2.237 billion, you're not making any money. You're losing a lot of money.
The Ontario Place deal costing us $2.27. I consider that money financed because there's no cash register there at Ontario Place that has $2.237 billion in it. No. We don't take the money from it. So we're going to invest this money. Investing is for people that have money. If you don't have the money to invest, you must take into account the cost of borrowing that money. Yeah. And they didn't do that. There's no financial case for Ontario Place. They didn't say to us, here's how much it's costing you to do this with the $2.237 billion now. We've spent that money now. We're going to collect the other money over 95 years. And it's only equivalent, the value today is only $163 million. So we collect $163 million over 95 years, and we've paid $2.237 billion. And then somebody says, well, you got a new Ontario Science Center. That's like, we already had one.
Yeah.
We already had one. We had Ontario Science Center. It was, I thought it was a fantastic building myself.
There was nothing wrong with that building.
No.
It served a lot of purposes. Yeah.
The building materials of the Ontario Science Center was built in 1967.
Something like that.
With materials of 1967. So it had everything that was used at the time. What were you using? We were still using asbestos. There's lots of things we were still using. Hot water radiant systems were very popular. But we don't tear all these houses down that we built around that time. And it wasn't just commercial that was being built around that time or a museum. Those are the materials that we were using then. Those were the building materials of the day. And the roofing panels they were talking about.
The leaking crap, yeah.
like what they're made of, and then Doug Ford's like, well, you can't just fix it with a shingle. It's like, well,
sure you can.
It's
not
like
with a shingle, but yes, you can.
you can change the whole roofing system if you really wanted
and
to.
And actually, from my understanding, engineers and architects stepped up,
Yes, they
willing to
did.
do it for pro bono. They were more than interested in doing it, but they didn't want to do that because Ford already made the deal. That deal was made. So
On the Ontario Place Therme lease on page 142, landlord event of default. The tenant shall be entitled to institute legal proceedings in a court of competent jurisdiction to collect any unpaid amounts owing by landlord. This is one-sided. Only the tenant has this option. The landlord does not have the same privilege of being able to take the tenant to court if they owe us money. They can take us to court if we owe them money, but we can't take them to court. And the money that's owed by us will be determined by the dispute resolution procedure. So the tribunal will determine that we owe the tenant money and it's not appealable. And then they get to take us to court to collect from us. The Ontario Auditor pointed out on page 68 that the Infrastructure Ontario Board of Directors received a direction from the government to accelerate site handover and construction following the new deal with the City of Toronto. If the site is handed over to the tenant earlier, once Therme has obtained its excavation permit, it would eliminate the province's ability to terminate the lease for convenience prior to fulfilling site readiness obligations. Should it choose to terminate the lease, the province instead would be required to provide a 5-year notice period after 10 years of operations. The obligation for Therme to pay rent would commence once the site is handed over. So the government is trying to shut down our options to be able to get out of this lease. They're trying to rush this. They instructed Infrastructure Ontario's board of directors to speed this up, to get it past the point that we can't get out of the deal. That's what our government's doing.
From the Ontario Place Therme lease, on page 146, Article 16 deals with default and remedies. In the event that the province has satisfied all of the landlord initial obligations by the applicable landlord initial obligation deadline, except for its obligation to acquire title to the city lands prior to the initial land acquisition deadline, and has in good faith undertaken the steps to expropriate the city lands in accordance with the Expropriation Act prior to September 30th, 2024, and such expropriations being challenged, no termination in respect of such failure shall take effect until it is finally determined by the courts that the province is not entitled to effect the necessary expropriation, or until 3 months following a final determination by the courts that the province is so entitled. If such court proceeding determines the province is not entitled to effect the necessary expropriation, then the landlord or the tenant may terminate this lease, and the liquidated damages payable by the landlord in such circumstances for failing to acquire title to the city lands will be only $5 million and not $30 million. And the regime change date shall not have occurred, and the tenant shall not be obligated to commence construction of the project. From the Ontario Place Therme lease on page 277, lending agreements and leasehold security. The landlord and the tenant shall not make any amendments to the lease that result in an increase to the rent payable by the tenant thereunder, or the shortening of the term thereof, or provides the landlord with any additional termination rights, materially increases the obligation of the tenant under the lease, or reduces, fetters, or removes rights of the tenant under the lease, in each case without the approval of the leasehold mortgagee. Any amendment of the lease by the landlord and the tenant in breach of this section shall not be binding on a leasehold mortgagee or lender until such leasehold mortgagee's approval is obtained in respect thereof. From page 199, 200, and 201 of the Ontario Place Therme lease, all disputes are to be resolved by arbitration and not by a court. The arbitrator shall have the jurisdiction and power to amend or vary any and all rules of the Arbitration Act determine the appropriate procedure for the arbitration, award any remedy or relief that a court or judge of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice could order or grant. And further, we see here, the award of the arbitrators shall be final and binding upon the parties. Both parties expressly waive all rights of appeal, including on a question of law. This is a kangaroo court. Why would the Crown be willing to subject themselves to a kangaroo court versus a real court? If the arbitrators would like to have the power of real judges, then we should be resolving all our disputes with this tenant in our courts, not within kangaroo courts.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. My name is Nina Deeb. Ontario had a debt of $337 billion in 2018. Current outlook 2024-2025 puts this debt to $429 billion. That's an increase of $92 billion. $21 billion was added this year alone. From page 135 of the housing starts formula, including additional residential units, student housing, long-term care beds, and retirement homes. This is creative calculating. I object to the reworking that is being counted as a home with every budget. This covers up that housing starts are declining. Ontario Place Therme lease is an excellent deal for Therme. The people of Ontario will never see any returns on the $2.237 billion of spending. The Auditor General revealed the present value of rent only amounts to $163 million of the total $1.1 billion of rent. This does not cover the interest payments on the money that the province borrowed. Even if the tenant were to prepay the rent, that still leaves a debt of over $2 billion. Interest to borrow $2 billion over 95 years. I've included the chart for you. I will not go over it. I used the rates from page 180 in the budget. This lease traps the Crown in arbitration with the tenant. That's Schedule D. The tenant is in a position to extract penalties from the Crown by arbitration. Page 66 and 65 of the Ontario Auditor report reveals that Infrastructure Ontario agreed to pay a $30 million penalty for not providing interim utility service required by Therme without first agreeing on what was needed to meet this obligation. This deadline's within the one-year cure period of December 31st this year. Infrastructure Ontario told the auditor it's expected the discussions will conclude by this same date. December 31st is too late to stop talking. This is within 15 days. The lease released October 3rd, 2024 is not the original lease. The original lease was signed the previous year under a different ministry and is dated July 29th, 2021. I'd like to see a copy of this lease. The current lease must be canceled. We're within 15 days. We're going to incur very heavy penalties, and it is not a good deal for the taxpayers. The $3 billion credit to taxpayers could cost taxpayers an additional $1.47 to $3.6 billion in interest over 10 years. We do not know what interest rates will be in the future. This is similar to taking a $3 billion cash advance on a credit card with no plans of repaying it. Trade lanes are federal, bike lanes are municipal. Each government must stay in their own lane to avoid collisions. No elected official should be surprised by another elected official from a different level of government driving straight at them. Bike lanes are a solution to traffic congestion. Modern planning designs that they be accessible for emergency vehicles. This is municipally funded infrastructure. These are local decisions. Bike lanes save lives. The data exists. There's a human cost to removing bike lanes. The government find it necessary to insulate themselves from lawsuits reveals that the government knows that their idea is fatal. The decision to close 10 supervised consumption sites is harmful. This action will lead to an increase in overdose deaths. This action, removing the sites, will not remove the overdoses. The overdoses will occur in public places. The sites ease the pressure on our emergency responses. A 911 call is responded to by police, fire, and paramedics. We do not want to go backwards. We've found a better way forward. Are there too many nonprofits? No, some of them are legitimate. Permitting P3 corporations under Ontario's nonprofit network is not appropriate. These NGO corporations were severed from the Ministry of Consumer Services. They're extremely wealthy monopoly corporations that are defunding Canada. Ontario, municipalities, and individuals. These corporations run the law for profit by arbitration while avoiding taxation on the billions of dollars they collect a year. When adjusted to population, Ontario has the lowest housing starts in history. Housing is the excuse for intervention, yet the new tools were not used to include the affordable housing component that municipalities requested. The auditor report on ministerial zoning orders reveals that the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing made MZOs instead of MZOs, which were introduced in 2020. The ministry had housing enabling tools but did not use them. Housing is provincial jurisdiction. The province downloads its housing responsibility to the municipalities and chooses to fine those that they have failed. It is housing that prevents homelessness. We should be building housing. I request $60 billion be downloaded to the municipalities who have the responsibility for this housing in order to make them whole and to meet their housing goals. The municipalities should be treated as partners in our housing ambitions and goals. Thank you for having me here today. I do look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. That concludes the presentations. We'll now start the questions, and with the official opposition, MPP Fife.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all presenters. Really good points made by all. Anita, I'm just going to start with you because I cannot believe that the Minister of Infrastructure signed this lease. The Therme Ontario deal, the 95-year-old lease, I think is going to join the ranks of the 407 as one of the worst deals ever signed, supposedly on behalf of the people of Ontario. And I have to say, I mean, listening to delegations from healthcare in particular and housing and mental health, the fact that we're subsidizing a European spa company to the tune of $2.2 billion is just astounding to me from a priorities perspective. I wanted to give you the opportunity, because you've given us the chart, but the top 3 concerns that you have with the lease, and please be succinct if you could. Thank you. Go ahead.
The top concern I have with the lease is the Crown being trapped in arbitration by the tenant. So the Schedule D, which is an arbitration, is dispute resolution. Courts are not available unless the tenant gives us permission to use a court. So the tenant's in control of whether the courts are available to the Crown, which is absurd. I've never seen anything like this in my life.
I totally agree. And what's your second one?
The second one is the parking provisions, which was Infrastructure Ontario's idea for the public to fund that, because Therme originally, in the report, it also said that Therme originally put in their submission that they would fund their own parking, but Infrastructure Ontario wanted us to fund it. So that's costing us over $400 million.
Thank you. And then the third one?
The third one would be the not having control over the public areas. So if we want to build above grade on the public realm, we need their permission to do so.
Imagine that. Imagine being absolutely in control, having the public asset, having the waterfront, knowing how valuable it is, and then essentially giving all of your power away to a corporation who will trap you into a 95-year lease. It really is quite something. So you've asked this committee to advocate for the cancellation of this deal. The fee, there's a penalty for that. Walk us through the penalty.
The penalty is $30 million, and we actually have, in my opinion, we have until December 31st this year to cancel this lease, even though there's wording regarding the first permit. I think that the December 31st could trigger an early beginning because of the trickery in the wording in the lease. So that December 31st is a vital date.
Thank you. And then just one final point is that, you know, the Auditor General in her report a week and a half ago indicated that taxpayers end up paying the price for MZOs. And ultimately, you know, everyone's very fond of saying there's one taxpayer. But it really does come down to, really sticking it to the citizens when you bypass our democracy, in our opinion. So thank you for providing the numbers. The interest payments alone will wreck the entire healthcare system for whatever we're fighting for here, right?
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to move on to Nina. Nina, thank you for being here, and thank you for calling out that housing starts have not been this low since 1955, I believe it is. In particular, I want to thank you for pointing out also all the intricacies of this quote-unquote deal with Therme. But I did want to ask, at the same time as the Therme deal, the government passed legislation allowing them to commit acts of misrepresentation, misfeasance, breach of trust, and bad faith without any consequences. What does that say to you as an Ontarian, that the government is allowing themselves to do such things, and they don't want any sort of repercussions for doing so?
That indicates to me that something wrong is going on, and I've read all the reports that have come out on Therme, from the lease to the ministerial zoning orders to the Ontario Auditor report. So things were not, no one's waterfront was treated the way that our waterfront was treated. All other waterfronts that it was compared to used a procurement process. It wasn't treated as a real estate transaction. And for it to be treated as a real estate transaction, I came to committee and asked for a copy of the lease, and it was not given to me. It should have been provided because it was a real estate transaction, and I'm a represented party, so it should have been provided when I asked for it. I don't know what my obligations are as a taxpayer when I don't know what's been signed on our behalf. So that was it's very concerning that everything has been done in it's a different process every which way you look at it. I've never seen anything like this lease, including the 407 deal.
It's I think in terms of obligations of every Ontarian household, it's around $400 that's being paid towards this Austrian elite spa.